you. Hi, everyone. My name's Tessa, like Josh said, and I'm the Watershed Policy Manager at Friends of the Chicago River. I just wanted to do a bit of an introduction to sort of lay the land of how the work of Friends of the Chicago River relates to the panel we're having today. So Friends of the Chicago River, our mission is to protect and restore the Chicago-Calumet River system for all people, water, and wildlife. My role is on the policy and planning team at Friends, where we work to address the systemic issues that impact the health of the Chicago-Calumet River watersheds. Because our water systems are connected, flooding is very much top of mind in our work, as it disproportionately impacts Black and Brown communities in our watershed. And this is not just a climate change issue, it's the result of historic disinvestment and environmental racism in the region. A key part of our advocacy work focuses on expanded stormwater solutions that include green infrastructure and nature-based investments, including increased tree plantings, native plants, bioswales, rain gardens, green roofs, and more. These types of investments tackle multiple public health issues at once, from flood mitigation to reduce urban heat island effect, better air quality, and greater access to recreation and open space. But before we can realize the vision of harnessing nature for stormwater, people's basic needs must be met. So Friends is honored to be hosting this event today with amazing speakers who will dive deeper into these problems and solutions. And with that, I'll pass it along to Alex.
Thank you so much, Tessa. Okay, my name is Alex Nitkin. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks so much for being here on this beautiful day at this beautiful locale. My name is Alex Nitkin. I'm the Government Finance and Accountability Reporter for Illinois Answers Project, which is the newsroom wing of the Better Government Association. Better Government Association is a 101-year-old nonpartisan, nonprofit investigative newsroom based here in Chicago. I and my work and us, my colleagues in general, focus a lot on city and regional and state policy and trying to, learn more about it and help our readers learn more about it. And so, as part of that, we had a big conversation, I and my colleagues, other reporters, earlier this year, about what are some of the issues that we want to write about, especially from a perspective of what we call of solutions journalism, trying to focus investigative journalism on people who are trying to solve big, difficult, systemic problems, essentially. And we talked a lot about the concept of climate resiliency as something that just isn't really talked about as much as it should be. We talk a lot about what the state and city are doing to combat climate change, but what's becoming a bigger and bigger question is how are we going to survive and adapt to the climate change that we know is coming? And that is how we really landed on talking about flooding and increased rain events, which are arguably the biggest threat to the region that climate change poses to us. And so we brought in these three excellent, knowledgeable panelists to talk about it. Just as a little bit of a preface, we're going to basically divide this conversation for the next hour into, number one, sort of what is the problem, what is the issue that we're talking about here, what is the reality of our vulnerability to flooding in the Chicago region. Number two, we're going to talk about what we can do as homeowners, as residents, on sort of a more individual or neighborhood basis to make ourselves more resistant to flooding impacts and be prepared for big rain events. And then third, and hopefully we can spend a lot of good time on this, what should we be doing as voters, as citizens, to sort of be demanding better solutions and better policy from state, regional, and local and federal government to make us more prepared as a whole. And so I want to go down and introduce Princess Shaw from Light Up Lawndale and the Westside Long-Term Recovery Group, Commissioner Dan Pogorzelski from the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District of Greater Chicago, and Catherine Alias, Senior Manager of Urban Resilience at Center for Neighborhood Technology. Thank you all so much for being here first. I want to just let you go down the line and first just introduce yourselves and talk a little bit about your connection to this issue.
Hey everyone, I'm Catherine Alias. I use she, her pronouns. At Center for Neighborhood Technology for the past, well, at least since 2013, probably a bit earlier, we've been working on the urban flooding issue when that 2013 flood had happened, with a lot of focus in the Calumet region. And so the Calumet region being the southern part of Cook County, we've been doing a lot of work with communities to talk about where the flooding issues are, understanding what they've been experiencing, which it wasn't just that one flood, and again, it wasn't just the floods that happened last year, but something that happens routine all of the time. And so we've been working with them to think about green stormwater infrastructure especially, but we're now like transitioned to not just think about green stormwater infrastructure, which is the idea of using nature-based solutions, but also using and combining and updating gray stormwater infrastructure, because a major issue is the disinvestment a lot of these communities face, and so the inability to really upkeep all of that maintenance. And so we've been working with communities to make sure that residents have the knowledge, data, and information and skills to be able to talk to their political officials to make changes in their community.
Hello, my name's Dan Pogorzelski. I know I'm shaped like a pierogi. It's very nice to meet everybody. So I'm a commissioner at the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District. Who knows what that is? I am so happy because I've had where people have come up to me and they give me their water bill. I'm like, oh no, that is
Do you mean
not
the
us.
Chicago Department of Water Management?
No, not at all,
Not
sir.
them?
Not at all. Not at all. That is not I. That is not I. So the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District, we have two responsibilities. Number one, what happens when you flush your water down the toilet? It ends up with us. We're the ones who keep it clean. Number two, we work all over Cook County with municipalities and units of government to do what? To try to work on stormwater solutions. My own path to this came from the complete grassroots. I've done many things in my life. I was a labor organizer. I met poor Alex. He had to meet me years ago when I worked for a state legislator. But in addition, I was the head of a local chamber of commerce, where my approach to it was just to be the biggest neighborhood advocate that you could be. It was a neighborhood called Avondale. And two of the things that I was involved in were in what were called green infrastructure projects. You're like, what the heck does that mean? It's simply a fancy way to say when you make it possible, just like in these permeable pavers that you have right here, for that water to be absorbed on site. Why is that important? Well, because in Chicago and in 3/4 of Cook County, the water that falls from the sky and the water you flush down your toilet go into the same sewers. Now, what happens when there's too much traffic? The Kennedy, the Dan Ryan, the Eisenhower. Traffic stops, right? So the more green infrastructure you have, the more of that pressure is taken off the sewer system so it doesn't back up into people's basements. And so my route into the environmental space, to aspiring to this position, was because of the fact that that's my jam. I want to make sure that people know about this, and for myself, I see myself as a connector, someone who can bring this to the over 126 municipalities, aside from the city of Chicago, that you have here in Cook County. And so we got to have the politician away from the microphone. I don't know if you have the crook here. Thank you, Princess. By the way, you have an accomplished neighborhood activist. So proud to be here with you.
Thank you. I appreciate it. My name is Princess Shaw. As he stated, I am an advocate. I have been working with somewhere between 600 to 750 people that were flooded last year from last year's flood just on the west side alone, from July of 2023. As a result of the immense, I'm going to say just record dropping rain that we had from last year. And so, as he said, my jam is just to, I'm going to steal that a little bit, is to just advocate for people, because a lot of people were not given, for lack of better words, the proper recognition of what this flood did to their basements. So basically what happened when they applied for FEMA disaster assistance, what ended up happening was they got very bare minimum amounts to help them with their basements. And then not to mention that we had another record rainfall in September of that same year. So I'm not sure for just for you guys record keeping basis, those were two disasters that were declared by the president in 1 year. And so if we're not having these realistic conversations about climate change and the infrastructure, and it's not to say that all infrastructure is bad, It's just to say that it's time to update it, right? So a lot of the infrastructure, for what I've learned in the last year, has been put in place since 1920, maybe the 1900s. And so, to his point, when you're trying to flush or have all this water going to the same spots, so materials, the infrastructure has, right? So a lot of it is clay. A lot of it needs to be redone. And to the other young lady's point about environmental, right? So we know we're actually, they had these conversations before about climate change, that it was coming. Just like Y2K, it's on its way, right? And so no one took it seriously. No one had a realistic conversation to the point where like, hey, all the great minds need to sit down together and let's start talking about a solution until now. And I kind of hate it to say it like this, but we're kind of 10 years too late because we have a deep tunnel that they're trying to build based upon the ideology from something back in 1950. So again, my job is just to advocate, and I know that if I were to have some of my survivors come out, and that's what we call them because they survived the flooding, they would not be able to express this calmly. So I try to be an advocate for them to say, hey, change needs to come. It's okay for you to be angry. It's okay for you to be traumatized, and it's okay for you to be frustrated. But how do we all sit at the same table and come about a solution? So that's why I am here to hopefully get a resolution and solution all at once.
Hopefully, by the end of the hour. Let's actually stay with you, Princess. Why don't you just tell us a little bit more about your experience and the experience of your neighbors and some of the folks you worked with last year. Obviously, there was the July 4th weekend storm, which was this big, generational, I think you could say, catastrophic storm. And part of it is just more rain dropped specifically on the west side than other parts of the region in places like Gulfport Park, Lawndale, where you live, Austin especially, even Cicero, Berwyn, the suburbs. But if you could tell us a little bit more about what that experience was like, what that did in terms of this sort of like consciousness or connection to the issue of you and your neighbors.
Sure. So what I will say is to the other young lady's point, this is not the first major flood that we had, right? So in the last 15-year span, there's been a total of 4. 2010, 2013, 2020, and 2023, which was just last year. And so I feel like the neighbors were like, hey, it's just a thing, it happened, we've been used to it, but there was no real protocols put in place until this past year. And what I mean by real protocols is because you have other states that actually flood, and Detroit being one of them, it's like, hey, okay, so we know they're flooding, now it's happening to us. And so, again, they have a very old infrastructure system as well, and it's like, so what do we do? Because we have people's basements that are flooded, and the traumatization part was a lot of these people just use their basements for storage. You may have a few here and there that actually live in the basement, but that storage, 30, 40 years is gone. There's nothing that they can do about it. And so that was why we took a huge step, several organizations as well as my own, like, hey, how do we help? And so we went out there and we talked with Streets and Sanitation, and we told them, like, listen, you have a majority of the population that was affected between the ages of 45 and 80, and what ends up happening is they can't go in those basements and move the stuff out, like refrigerators or deep freezers or even the couches that they had down there. It's like, how do you help? And of course, with anything, when you're doing change, there was some resistance, and we can't go in there. The laws say we can't go in anyone's basements. And so after a few back and forth meetings and conversations, they at least, Streets and Sanitation, at least allowed their laborers, of course they were paid time and a half, but they actually went into the basements and took some of the stuff out for the seniors. And so that in itself was a huge help. And so for me, I know I tell people always, it's always the baby steps for me, and that was a huge step, right, for me in my eyes, but in them, it was like, oh, that's just nothing, but it was something, because that meant a lot, even though we had to have several hours of conversations with people, because if you're moving out a treasure chest or a dresser that their mom or grandma left to them, and it was in that basement, that was heartbreaking. they didn't want to part with it. Pictures, years of pictures. I've seen documents from like the 1900s that were just destroyed from this flooding. And then not to mention that even when you went into some people's basements, even some of the basements you could still walk in and still have puddles of water in the basement. So it was a really like eye-opening thing for me because my basement didn't flood. And so it's like to see someone else's basement flood, and then how do you be community, right? Because if this young lady here, her basement flooded, oh, the way that we have become, not all of us, majority, that's her problem. And it's not because it could be her basement today and my basement tomorrow. And we know, just looking at the record, 2010, 2013, so that means it's coming again. And so it's like, how do we prepare and get a solution in place now before that happens? So.
Right. I want to pass it down to Catherine to talk a little bit more on this theme of regional disparities, because one thing that we were looking at as we were reporting on this topic, I should have mentioned at the top, we at Illinois Answers had a big package of stories talking about various different responses to flooding. We were trying to understand these catastrophic impacts to the west side. How much of that is because of how much it rained on the west side, and how much of it is because of unique vulnerabilities that disinvested neighborhoods and west side neighborhoods have. And so, Catherine, you've done a lot of studying of specific, geographic vulnerabilities. So, could you talk to us a little bit about, within the region, which areas are the most vulnerable to rain events, and how do we sort of parse out, as a follow-up, how much of that has to do with, ecological impacts, and how much of that is, the infrastructure that's built in?
Yeah, so I want to say I don't know exactly where the rain will fall. But I can talk about the vulnerabilities, right? Because vulnerability isn't just where rain will fall, but what is the resources in that community. And so CMT did a study between, I think, around 2014 when they were looking at insurance claim payouts. And they saw that a lot of the amount of insurance claim payouts were highest in communities that were predominantly black or brown and predominantly low income or color. And so that really indicates that a flood will happen. Some people will be okay. They will have the economic wherewithal or power, or however much money they have to be able to respond to the flooding, or they were able to put mitigation responses onto their own property, and so they didn't get as impacted by that flooding. But to Princess's point, right? Like some of these communities are seniors. They've lived there for decades. These are generational homes. They don't necessarily have the income to put in all those mitigation pieces, and so one, they have not necessarily the economic resilience there to respond to the flooding issues, and two, they also are dealing with repetitive flooding issues, and that is in part due to the infrastructure. And so we know that there's a history of racism in the United States that also impacted how infrastructure dollars were spent and where people felt like money should go. Oftentimes, when we're thinking through the decades, that there's a lot of money that goes into fixing higher income households because they want to make sure their properties are protected, and they are able to advocate to their politicians about making sure that their properties are protected. That was not necessarily the case for low-income households, especially households of color, because of racism. And so a lot of the investments weren't happening at the same pace. Their pipes might not be at a larger capacity. They didn't have as recent improvements. And so there's this infrastructure, a lack of infrastructure resilience in that same case. In addition to that, Commissioner was talking about green stormwater infrastructure, right? We know a lot of the city of Chicago is built up. Where there's new development, like if you see a lot of these new buildings, they have to build to contain more of that stormwater. But if you're in an area that has like a cold market where like they're not doing a lot of development, a lot of those areas don't have to build for that. They don't have to retrofit, like they don't have to fix their area to increase that stormwater resilience. And then part of that cold market, in addition to that, there are very heavy industry areas, right? So there's a lot of asphalt, there's a lot of like parking lots, a lot of buildings, and not enough area for the water to just be on site. And so if you're including all of those pieces, that's why we see a lot of vulnerability on the west side and on the south side particularly.
So going over to Commissioner Dan, continuing to zoom out, what are the unique flood vulnerabilities that the Chicago region has that maybe stand it apart from other parts of the country or other parts of the world?
Well, how much of our fresh water is in our Great Lakes? In the whole world? Anyone know?
I think I know.
Not 95%, 1/5. You mentioned what kind of soil do we have? Clay, right? We have clay soil. Did you ever hear the old phrase, your strength is also your weakness? Those clay soils, which are so impermeable, right, that they hold in 1/5 of the world's fresh water, also make it difficult for different solutions that people will say, oh, well, they've tried this here, they've tried this there. It's one of the reasons why we're so proud. When they had that mania of privatization, no, we kept everything in-house in the Water Reclamation District. So the specialists who know what the hydrological system is like here in the Chicago area are here. By the way, one of the interesting things when you're talking about, do you guys know that here in the state of Illinois, you can see dinosaurs at the Field Museum, but there are no dinosaur remains here in the state of Illinois. Anyone know why? Because of the warm water sea. That clay soil's been around for a long, long time. So, when you're getting back to here in the Chicago area, where were we built on? We were built on a swamp, that's right. And so we're built on an area which has a wealth of water. It's one of the reasons why we want to make sure that they don't pipe it away. Shameless plug there.
I read the Tribune letter to the editor, yeah.
Yes. And so we have unique characteristics as other places do. A point of personal privilege here. People will ask, what the heck does a Water Reclamation District Commissioner do, right? And in my case, I think that one of the beautiful things of the role is it's up to you. You decide what it is. And so for myself, I've made it a point. Does anyone know how big Cook County is in terms of population? 5.25 million people. So if you add up Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, North Dakota, and South Dakota, we have more people. Of course, they have 1/10 of the U.S. Senate. We elect part of 2, but let's not get into that subject. And so that's a lot of people. And so for myself, when those horrible floods happened, not only did I make sure, and I'm sure many of my colleagues did as well, reached out to every single, not just alderman in the city of Chicago, asked them. In that same stormwater episode, you had where Congressman Garcia actually got stormwater. And obviously the West Side, Cicero, Summit, many of these areas that you had that were disproportionately hit in that stormwater event. But I made it a point to go to events with my colleagues. So with President Kerry Steele, we were there, Alderman Irvin's ward. State Representative LaShawn Ford invited me to 2 of the meetings that he had at the West Side Health Center. And I remember that heartbreak. You know, we often say at Water Rec that we're like Parks and Rec, like nobody knows who you are, what you do. But if you ever wanted to see how meaningful that work is, that was the meeting. Because you saw, you see a grandma, someone that you just want to hug because she's full of love, right? You just want to go up to her. But she's heartbroken because she doesn't know what she's going to do, literally having human waste up to her knees, right? And so you saw how important this work is, what the heartbreak is. And it's one of the reasons why we're very proud of the Water Reclamation District. We don't have first priority, right? Local municipalities, they have first jurisdiction. But equity is at the core of what we do with over 250 projects under our belt and always making sure that it is not based upon the means to pay. We base our projects on what people can pay and try to work at ways that we can get to yes.
The point is, this is a massive superhighway network of pipes that is working really hard underneath us every single day. But a lot of it also, it starts in our homes. So as part of your job, I understand a lot of it is just talking to a lot of homeowners about
a lot of stakeholders. It's important to remember. I apologize, like, oh Lord, this guy, you just cut this guy off, sorry. But not just homeowners, but let's remember, you have a multiplicity of units of government. Do you guys know how many mosquito abatement districts there are in Cook County? 1, 2, 3. 3. So there's a lot of different units of government. Sorry, Alex, go ahead.
That's a good point. And speaking as a renter myself, I appreciate you speaking up on my behalf as well. But talking to people who experience flooding, who might be responsible for being stewards of properties, what are some ways that people can, especially if they're in a floodplain or in an area, and you can all chime in on this, simple ways or inexpensive ways that we can try to reduce our chances of, say, our basement flooding.
Do you want me to go first? I just don't want to hog the mic.
Why don't you go first quickly, and then anyone else?
Quickly? Oh, Lord. A new skill set I have.
Not timing you.
All right. So one of the first things that I'd like to point out, do you guys ever hear disconnect the downspout?
Yeah.
Okay, so some people have not heard this. So think about it. The example I began with is the Kennedy Expressway, any of these roadways, right? When there's too much traffic, what happens? Traffic stops. 99.9% of the time, all of this is sufficient. But guess what? We know that from time to time, the amount of water will overwhelm. What can we do to stop that? When I say disconnect the downspout, we have rain barrels. We actually have them at a discount. We'll deliver them to your home, and there's even a senior discount. Why? 5.25 million people, you're talking about millions of homeowners. Now, when you'll talk to people in different villages, they'll tell you, you know, our guy, he goes out there and he'll ticket someone when they, for example, in that municipality, are supposed to not have the downspout go straight into the sewer. Because when you have millions of people having that downspout go straight in the sewer all at the same time, it doesn't take a lot of imagination to figure out what's going to happen. And so by disconnecting that downspout, whether it's an MWRD provided rain barrel, which you can have up to 2 at a significant discount on our website, mwrd.org, you can also have it where there's a rain garden that you could install either in the front or in the back of your house. Just doing that will help with how much pressure's on the system. Through our social media, you can see sometimes I like to make myself a little bit of a spectacle for the purpose of making these solutions a little bit more memorable. But what's important is that we ourselves, for example, in a rain event, can wait a little bit, turning on the dishwasher, from taking a shower, right? I'm not saying go a week without taking a shower, just wait a couple hours. These things, when they compound, can have a dramatic difference, and we'll post it on our social media. Our colleague commissioners will do it. The Water Reclamation District will do it. And so, when you're talking about kind of low-hanging fruit, I would say that is the first one.
How about from Princess, you and your neighborhood groups, have there been any specific kinds of tools that you've seen folks use that either planting things or disconnecting downspouts, or even what have, as you've been dealing with MWRD, Department of Water Management, has there been anything that
So I will
tips
say
that they've given?
I will say I've heard all these lovely ideas.
Yeah.
But I feel, as well as many others, that would work in a perfect world, right? And so we all know we don't live in a perfect world. So what we have suggested those items, but again, you're talking about seniors, right? And so when those rain barrels fill up, who's going to be there to dump them, right? Who's going to help them maneuver these obstacles? And they're obstacles because if you're at a certain age, you're not going to be able to move like myself or yourself in order to make these things happen. So we have suggested that. We have pushed those ideas, but we have, from the community standpoint, taken more of a grassroots, more realistic approach. Meaning, when we go into some of these basements, we're seeing that in 2010, 2013, when we're going in these walls and we're doing muck outs and taking the drywall out and putting it in the alley or the doors that have swollen up, we're like, okay, how do we help? And the first thing that we've been doing, when the people finally get all this stuff out and they do the mold mediation, the mold abatement, the next thing that we're doing is putting green or purple boards up. Those same boards that you would put behind your showers, right? Because again, in a perfect world, taking those downspouts out, it goes with a cost too. So if it's going directly in my drain, if I'm not an adamant person that knows how to do that, I have to pay somebody to come out to do that. And then a lot of these people have been getting scammed too. So it's a whole a lot of different factors, but it's like, okay, when they go to put their walls back up, as opposed to just putting regular drywall up, put the green or purple boards up, so that way, if there is another flood, there's not so much water that's absorbed into the drywall that then makes your basement unhealthy or unsafe to live in. And then also, we've been explaining to them too. Some have had these backflow valves, sub pumps, catch basins. They didn't work. And it's just, I can't stress it enough, it did not work. So making sure that they're understanding that if you do have these extra additives on, that they're getting yearly maintenance, right? Because a lot of them got them and didn't know that they had to have them maintenance. So making sure that they're aware of that. And then the last thing, just again, having them to be more advocates for themselves, right? Going to the legislators and like, hey, I got a tree in my front yard, and in that tree, what's happening is because of this rain and the kind of periodic, for the last 3 years, where there's been periodic dry spouts, where these big rains, when they do come, the tree's roots are so big. If you look at some of these neighborhoods on the west side, they've been there for 30, 40 years, if not more. So what those tree roots are doing now, they are going and finding water sources, which are these pipes. To his point, they're old. And so if you think about it, you have a 40-year-old tree, those trees, I never knew how strong a tree root could be, but it's crushing these pipes and literally in the ground to get that water source. So those are just a couple of things that we've been working on.
I mean, you bring up a really important point, which is that there are all kinds of things that someone could try to do, often at personal expense to themselves. You could get a rain barrel, you could disconnect your downspout, you could dig a trench or a garden, but you know what all of those people have in common who get those things? They're already paying taxes. They're paying taxes to the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District, which is, a lot of people don't realize, it's $1 billion agency. 6% of your property taxes go to the MWRD. It's got a huge job. You're already paying taxes to the Department of Water Management, and ultimately this is a collective responsibility, and this is sort of why we have government at the end of the day, in large part. And so let's use that as an opportunity to shift more toward government policy solutions and systemic solutions. Catherine, you brought up gray infrastructure versus green infrastructure. So let's talk a little bit more about, could you just break down for us, sort of, first of all, just define what the difference is, and then what are the benefits and drawbacks, I guess, of the different kinds of gray versus green infrastructure, specifically that, collective that local governments can create to take some of this burden off of neighbors.
Yeah. So gray infrastructure, think about your traditional pipes, think about the water reclamation plant itself is a gray infrastructure, think about storage basins where they're literally holding water. Any of those things are gray stormwater infrastructure. Green stormwater infrastructure, like Commissioner said, it's where they are holding the water on site, so permeable pavement. You can think about rain gardens, trees are an example. If you think about some streets that have there are sidewalks and bike lanes, but then they have these beautiful planters on the sides. Another type of green stormwater infrastructure, they can be really small size to your property for a house, or really large. So if you think about some very large basins, I live in Glenview. They is a newer developed area. They took part of the Air Force area that was there and made part of it into a huge basin to hold water. That's an example of green stormwater infrastructure. And what was the second part of your question?
So what are the different ways that governments that your town, MWRD, the state even, can build gray or green infrastructure into communities? And what are sort of the benefits and drawbacks of each compared to each other?
Yeah, so gray stormwater infrastructure isn't the worst thing in the world, right? It has allowed us to have very high, dense communities where we are able to live where we are. But it also needs maintenance. Just like green stormwater infrastructure, everything needs maintenance. And a problem I've seen generally, just governments overall, not just for stormwater, but also our roads, we're not very good at maintenance. We're very good at building the first thing, but not maintaining it. And so creating government systems to allow for that maintenance is super important. In terms of the benefits, green stormwater infrastructure, because we've done so much development, we've lost a lot of the natural ability to absorb that. It's getting worse with climate change, like Princess said. We needed solutions 10 years ago, so we need to create create more of those green spaces where possible, and think about green stormwater infrastructure that provides multiple benefits. That's a really nice thing, right? We have a tree. Another huge climate change issue is heat, right? Like we're experiencing really hot days. There are a lot of green stormwater infrastructure options that also provide benefits for dealing with urban heat island effect, which is when you feel more heat in more developed areas, and that especially impacts also the south and west sides where there aren't as much shade structures. And so that's a benefit of green stormwater infrastructure, in addition to creating community spaces, cleaning air pollution. Whereas gray stormwater infrastructure, it's more of like a one and done kind of deal. It's harder to have the multiple solutions, and so thinking about the both and is super important for government. There's a lot of government funding out there from the federal to the local level. There's also ways that maybe we can think about how development, like the stormwater, like the metric that new developments have to do new like stormwater management. Think about how do we think about for older, especially industries that have had that property for a long time, how can we get them to retrofit? That might be another opportunity. So those are some of the ideas I've had that we've talked about. I'm also thinking about rail tracks. Railways are their own like entity, right? Like we have a bajillion different like jurisdictions. Railways are their own entity. Railways have cut through the ways that piping and stormwater flows. And so how do we get our railway systems to also think about stormwater management on their land, especially in the very heavy industrial area. Like Chicago's heavy industry is in part due to the heavy rail system that we have. And when you look at communities like Chatham, where you have like the highway bisecting, you have different rail systems. Same with the Calumet region. It prevents stormwater from flowing to where it can naturally go, and so it gets pooled. And so really thinking about all the different jurisdictions that we might not think of as a natural solution, getting them pulled into that, because silos are probably the most problematic thing about government. And when we because the local municipality handles that first pipeline and then MWRD handles the next, where is that boundary between the first and that second level, right? Where is the boundary between the railway and the city and then private property, right? Like we have these very distinct boundaries that water does not believe in. We're gonna have a problem, which is why we're having the problem that we have.
So let's talk then about the work of trying to eat away at decades-old disparities and inequities in the way that different parts of the region are prepared or not prepared for this. You mentioned where projects are laid out, the MWRD. Can you talk a little bit more about how, kind of on a philosophical level and down to a project level, a big government agency like MWRD and maybe some of its sister agencies at the city and county and state level are wrapping their heads around trying to build equity into how it operates and is trying to, make the region more resilient?
Absolutely. So I just want to begin with one thing. One of the questions, if you don't mind, I'll just answer. So we don't have first jurisdiction, so we cannot go in and tell a municipality, oh, you need to make X pipes larger. We can only go in when we get invited in. When they're like, hey, we would like to enter into a partnership with you. And then we are more than happy to do that. And also one of the other things I do want to, because it had been brought up earlier, is that with the difficulty of maintaining green infrastructure, we actually make it a point to have intergovernmental agreements that say, hey, we're going to go in and we're going to chip in. I don't know if I had mentioned this before. If I mentioned the second time, I apologize. Over 250 projects, over $550 million is what we've put in towards trying to stop flooding. Now, of course, the needs are greater. We rally our congressmen, we rally other folks, but we're constantly working on that. But with regards to, I'll give you an example of one program. It's called Space to Grow. Has anyone heard of this? Started in 2014. It's exclusively with the City of Chicago Public Schools. It's a green infrastructure program. What is the point of it? Number one, the plant of a school, right? Typically large. When you look at where we've had these Space to Grow schools that have been selected since 2014, overwhelmingly on the south and west sides of Chicago, because of the fact that that is where there is a profound need. What is the point of this? Well, if we're able to take that dramatic roof load that's generated on that large site and able to absorb it right where it falls, what that does is that all of a sudden, a lot of pressure that was there before, that was in that neighborhood, has been taken off. I'm actually very proud that in 2022, so I believe it was 2022, when they had at Thorpe School, that's where the mayor's, two of his kids actually go to school there, had where I myself got to participate with other folks from what's called WEFTech. That's a national gathering of water professionals. As a volunteer task, what we did is that there we actually helped build the rain gardens that you had that were on site, the permeable pavers, not just like, oh, we got to do this, like literally like over there, like yes, this must be the first time because you did not do that the right way. So a program like that, and there are many other partnerships that we have, helps to make sure that we can begin to address, to make sure that all areas of Chicago are treated equally, because that is the ethos that we have, and we always approach it that way. Thank you.
So I want to ask one more question for Princess, and then we'll go to Q&A here. How can we be better citizens on this issue? What are the questions that we should be asking our elected officials like Dan? What are the things that we should be demanding of our elected officials on this issue?
So I had the privilege, it was a company called Black Resilience Network. So they work on a national level for a lot of Black and brown communities that are underserved when it comes to climate change. We took a little trip out to Washington, D.C. to visit FEMA. And so some of the feedback that we got, because we asked those hard questions, it was a summit that was the second week in June, and those hard questions that we asked is like, hey, how do we get you guys to spend more money with the city that actually needs help? Some of the feedback we got was like, hey, they just have to ask. They need to ask us. And so I can, without a shadow of a doubt, state that for the July 2023 flooding that happened, it took 45 days for FEMA to get here, right? And so to what the young lady was saying, where you have silos in government, and I think even Dan kind of mentioned it, like, hey, they have to ask us to come in, right? I think when the founding fathers made the Constitution, right? Let's go all the way back there. They didn't have it figured out. You know, you went from different parts until they figured it out, right? And so coming back to modern urban day, we still don't have it figured out, and we have a lot of municipalities that are not willing to work together, no matter how much taxes, whether she's paying more taxes, I'm paying more taxes, it's just not a thing. And so until someone is able to say, hey, I don't have to be the lead on this, I'm not a big dog in this fight, we all need a whole bunch of little dogs and little poodles running around here to make this work, we're going to always be at a disadvantage in our Black and brown communities as a result of that. And so I'll even take it one step further. When Dan was just saying now, the Commissioner Dan was just saying like, hey, we have to wait for the city to let us know. And I don't know, maybe 2/3 of the aldermen are new. They have no clue. And then with them having no clue and they're being trained as they come in by older aldermen, did they have a clue, right? Because again, we're 10 years behind. And I hate to keep beating that over everyone's head, but we are 10 years behind. And it's because no one really took the knowledge or the time to stop and say, hey, let's figure this out. So until we get to that point, we're going to continue to have this flooding, right? He can sit here and he can give us, God bless his ministry, he can give us all of the numbers that he can. But if that connection, and again, there's supposed to be sister agencies, until they can link up in order to have that realistic conversation like, hey, there's no big I's, there's no little U's here, then we're going to always be at a disadvantage. And then with our aldermen not knowing 100% as to what's going on, they're relying on their knowledge, right? So it's all about everyone learning how to get along and work together that they tell us to do in communities, but they're not even doing it at a higher level, right? So until we're able to sit down at a table and we see each other, I've told many elected officials, don't be so defensive, right? Apologize. I can tell you that without a shadow of a doubt, a lot of these people just want an apology. Whether you did it, whether you didn't do it, I'm sorry. And don't cut them off. Listen. I've seen too many politicians, oh, well, that doesn't what happened in the NASCAR. Just listen, right? Because the myth is out there. They believe that what happened, the water got switched around, and it was to benefit one neighborhood outside of the other. Let's talk about the elephant in the room. But whether it happened or not, it will always be elusive. But again, how do you get past that hurt? Apology. I apologize that happened. I apologize you feel that way. But now how do we move forward? But then if we don't see them working together to move forward, I'm stuck in a place of anger, right? I'm stuck in a place of frustration. So we'll never amount to anything because we're always behind the 8 ball with just our elected officials and our different city municipalities, even on the state level, on a federal level, working together. Once they can understand that everyone's a human being, because sometimes I've talked to people and they have this whole really bad ego and just like they're not a human being. It's just like, it's amazing how they've been in office for 20, 30 years. So I would say the most important thing is let's actually have a sit-down conversation where it's okay to be vulnerable and say, I didn't know, right? And that's what it boils down to, because no one knew 20 years ago that this was going to be a real thing.
Yeah. I think that the lesson and the takeaway from this is just let's all be bigger pains in the butt about this to people who have some power or agency or authority over this, because this issue is not going away. In fact, it is getting worse. It is rapidly getting worse. It's going to continue to get worse. And it never is really the sort of issue du jour that any political or policy leader wants to talk about until there's a July 3rd rainstorm. And so it's really just we have to keep asking lots of questions and be like, hey, Alderman, what can you tell me about this issue? What do you know about it? Why don't you know more about it? Why aren't you doing more? So with that, we have a few minutes for Q&A. I have some folks put in advance, but first just take a quick check. Are there folks with questions here? Okay, go ahead.
Can you provide contact information?
Yes.
Will it be emailed to us?
Contact, yeah, you can come talk to us, or we can get that figured out with our great organizers. Yeah.
My chief of staff is right there, Jack. If anybody needs to connect, he's right there.
Let's take one. Oh, sure, go ahead.
What was the impetus behind the Deep Tunnel project, and why don't we get that kind of effort today? I mean, that was a huge project in Chicago, right, decades ago. How did that come to be, and why isn't anything big happening right now?
That is a great question. So this is actually what was submitted, and I was literally about to ask about it, so thank you so much for bringing that up. The Deep Tunnel project you asked about, the tunnel and reservoir plan. Can anyone who wants to talk about TARP and the Deep Tunnel, what is it, and why is it not sufficient on its own, I guess is the addendum question that I would ask to solving our flooding issues.
Awesome. All right, so I just want to make sure everyone's cool with me. I don't want to be like, Pogo, hogging the mic again. So maybe I'll begin with this. A lot of the issues that we've been talking about, for us, we are typically engineers. We have been in a new role, which is engaging with people, trying to get social buy-in to do these solutions that need social buy-in, like disconnecting downspouts. So for me, it started with social media. Why am I bringing this up? Well, not that long ago, one of the reels that I had was with one of the commissioners at the Water Reclamation District who was there in 1990, who recounted to me with glee how happy he was that in 1990 he got a report on his desk. That report said the Chicago River had gone from being toxic to merely being polluted. The fact that we have that is because of the deep tunnels. So, up until the 1970s, how did the United States treat its waterways? As open air sewers. How many species of fish lived in the Chicago River in the 1970s? Seven. I've heard 5 as well. So both of those are acceptable answers. Why did that happen? So folks will visit the water reclamation district, including a group from Dubai just 2 weeks ago. And what do they say? The specific fragrance. I might have to change my clothes after I get out. Now that's just after an afternoon there. Can you imagine what the fish and the aquatic life had to live through when you had sometimes 100 days where the combined sewers in emergencies to keep people from flooding in their basements went into where? The Chicago River. That has now become a rarity. Why? Because there's an escape hatch, you could say, when that water from the sky and the water from your toilet goes into the same sewers. Thanks to gravity, there is an expansive system over 100 miles. Much of it's so big you could take a semi-truck through it. That leads to large reservoirs. How big will it be when it's completed? 17.5 billion with a B gallons. Now here's the issue. Many of those flooding episodes that you have don't happen because we don't have enough storage space in that system. In fact, on those rains, we received, by the way, that had not been predicted. It was not on the 24 hours beforehand. Nobody said, oh, horrible storms are on the way. That is not what our meteorological specialist said. Sorry, Tom Skilling. No. What happened, though, is that already 8:30, 9 o'clock, we were getting folks who were talking about their homes getting flooded. It wasn't because of the fact that there wasn't capacity in the deep tunnel system. The reservoir wasn't filled until after 1 p.m. All that flooding that happened in between, it's because of the fact that the sewers that were held by the local municipalities could not absorb it. This is why we are here preaching green infrastructure, so that instead of those sewers, which are overwhelmed, now of course, these solutions that happen, they don't get as much attention as the deep tunnel system. The deep tunnel system, people from all over the world come and travel to see us. But I mentioned 250 projects. That's a lot of projects. And what we aspire to do is every single person that you're able to prevent flooding that happens in their home, it's like you saved the world. And that's what we're aspiring to do, is every single person that we're able to help prevent through green infrastructure, through these projects, is able to change it. I had a meeting not that long ago in South Holland with the mayor, who on the one hand said, you know, that reservoir, the Thornton Reservoir, which by the way has never been full. The Thornton Reservoir has never been full, ever. And when it fills up, it's not the best sense. The mayor of South Holland, he told us, like, you know, the good news is that you guys are working with us. I appreciate you for that, Commissioner Pogo, because the scents are not as bad as it was. Our engineers thinking up of new ways to try to lessen that burden. But you know what did happen is that for those folks who don't have to deal with those flooding issues the way they did, that put their homes on a different financial trajectory, because all of a sudden your biggest investment is what? Your home. And when you have folks in the Southland who are able to have where that flooding no longer affects them, that's a win. Now the thing is that we're working. We could use more money, right, from our federal allies. We could definitely use it. And we would be happy to have our engineers put to work on it. But the smaller scope of the system, not as sexy as the deep tunnel. And so there's constantly work that's being done. As I mentioned, 250 projects, $550 million. The local municipality has the responsibility for maintaining it. Now, we have $1.5 billion. Wow! Sounds like a lot. Not when you're talking about 5.25 million people. I'm reminded, anyone ever heard of Alan Dixon? He was a U.S. Senator. He had this great quote. Every idea is a good idea, but every idea needs money. And so we are all about it. We would love to have more resources from our federal partners, right? The thing is that we have to be good stewards of the taxpayer dollar. Here's an interesting thing. Do you know how the McCook Reservoir, we have where, to try to lessen that burden off of taxpayers, what do? We have where it is excavators, limestone excavators, that are taking that, so that way we can have that money freed up for projects, whether it's in Robbins, whether it's on the west side, or anywhere else where we work. And so, if you're asking, well, the MWRD, can you pay for trying to maintain this infrastructure? That means that you're taking money from projects that are elsewhere where the scope of need is dramatic. The scope of need is great. And so, the more money that would go to maintaining those projects, the less money there is for trying to start new ones. And the heartbreak that you spoke about, right? We have a dramatic situation that we need to address, and we are focused on it, and we need to be responsible stewards of the taxpayer dollar. And so I hope I answered your question. Thank you.
Anyone else, Catherine or Princess, on sort of whose responsibility this should be difficulties or challenges of that kind of maintenance factor that we don't like to think about so much?
So I will say this, from my answer, I will say all of us, right?
It'd be poodles.
Yeah.
Poodles for environmental justice.
Of course, right? Poodles. And the reason why I'm saying that is because, again, so what we're trying to do is we're trying to fit an octagon into a circle, right? And it's not going to fit, right? Because of the groups. And so there should be a short term and a long term, right? The short term being, okay, let's take the downspouts out, let's do the water barrels, but, and please correct me if I'm wrong, what I'm hearing and what I have been hearing, as well as others, is that doing that with the rain barrels as well as with the downspouts is seemingly trying to be made just the solution as a whole. And so when you're trying to make that just the solution part, and then we get away from the fact of the matter that they're talking about building another deep tunnel to go along with the one that's already in existence, when maybe possibility, like this young lady said, let's consider those railways that are no longer being used, right? How do you sew those up so water can go through them? They're not being used for trains anymore, so that would be more of a long term. And then those dollars could then, to your point, stretch further, right? Because now it won't take as much money to build a brand new one, but if you, for lack of better words, patch it together, and then we have different areas, because that's what happened on the west side. I think it's called the North Channel waterway that comes through the west side, down Chicago Avenue or something like that. You can always correct me, but it's one big tunnel that comes through. And to your point, with the city, again, working together, those little poodles, hey, we know that those pipes between the city and the homeowners' homes, that's why they started that whole drainage program, right, to help out with that. But if I'm only fixing the city side, and my homeowner side still needs to be fixed. So just making sure that we sit down again as all little poodles, look at what the problems are, right? So you got the deep tunnel, that's not the final answer. You got the drainage, that's a problem. You got the pipes that lead from the city to the homes, and then pipes from the homes to the city side. All that stuff needs to be looked at. And so what we're doing is we're constantly like, okay, I done my part, so now it's on you, young lady. You got to do your part now. But if I don't have the money, so it's just another problem that we're just creating. So that's all I have, just being little governmental poodles everywhere.
Absolutely. Princess Shaw led up Lawndale and West Side Long-Term Recovery Group. Commissioner Dan Pogorzelski, Metropolitan Water Reclamation District, Greater Chicago. Catherine Alias, Center for Neighborhood Technology. Please join me in thanking all of them for this great discussion. Thanks so much to the Ridge House Museum for hosting us here.
All right, yeah.
And the Friends of Chicago River for helping us organize this. And thanks everyone for coming.
And give a round of applause to Alex Nitkin.
Yeah, woohoo! All right.
And yes, to Moon and Mohammed for organizing, and Saloni Nahar and Kayla McLeod.
Thank you for the camera, yes.
And we'll be here to talk to anyone who wants to continue the conversation. Yeah. Thanks everyone.